Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast. I am delighted to welcome the award-winning learning and development company Abstract to deliver today's critical thinking webcast. We are joined by two directors from Abstract, CEO Andy Nicol and Commercial Director Mark Fryer. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the online function to submit these, and Andy and Mark will answer these at the end of the webcast. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll now pass over to Andy.
Thanks, Margot. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining this webcast today. Abstract, delighted to be working with Chartered Banker on this. We've enjoyed a great relationship with them for many years, and so we're very happy to contribute to their lockdown learning series. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of forming sound judgment and decision making in unexpected times. Well, most surely these are unexpected times. So just to mark your card of what we're going to do here today, I'm going to give you a short introduction, a positioning piece, if you like, on our research into judgment decision making, and then Mark's going to take you through the bulk of the session. And as Margot said at the end, we've got some time scheduled for a Q&A at the end. So there's no doubt that we've been researching judgment decision making for about 3 years now, but without a doubt, COVID-19 has really brought a lot of the subject matter into sharp focus. So as I said, we've been researching for 3 years with our partners in financial service, and we've been trying to look into it in a bit more detail. We were driven by urgency. We began looking for the obvious problem to solve, maybe to be coupled with a set of quick fix solutions that could be rolled out across small or large organizations overnight. Unsurprisingly, that just was not to be. So our research told us that during the credit crisis of 2008, culturally, all financial institutions went into lockdown. Not the lockdown we now know, but the lockdown nonetheless. They stopped accepting risks via the traditional reward-seeking method, and they began applying a total threat avoidance approach to everything. And what's interesting, 12 years on, we now find a more liberal view at the top of companies. The executive, the leadership are quite more open to things. However, the views and behaviours throughout the rest of organisations, as you go down through them, are permanently wedded to strictly following process, rendering judgment and decision-making generally null and void. So this is what we want to do. We want to change the mindset. So Mark is going to take you through the session. We're going to break down judgment and decision-making to its component parts, and then looking at them on an individual basis and then bring them back together. So I'm going to hand it over to Mark now to take you through the rest of the session, and I'll be back later on for the Q&A. Mark.
Super. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Margot. Thanks for joining, everybody. So, as Andy said, we set off 3 years ago with our research and development, and we're still developing it today. It will continue. This will never end in terms of this topic, this subject matter. Our solution and our development resulted in the critical thinking series. So my challenge today is to try and shoehorn some of those key nuggets and takeaways in those last 3 years to share with you in the next 40-45 minutes, particularly around the area of judgment and decision making. But I wanted to just show you this, because this is our critical thinking series, and if you like, these are dials. So depending on the client that we're working with,
Mark,
we may find...
Mark, can I just interject? There might be a technical issue here because the screen's not sharing. So if we could get some assistance, Margot, can you... There we go.
Sorry, yes, Mark, if you can share your screen again.
Okay, no problem.
There we go. That's it, Mark.
Thank you, Andy. That would have been interesting to have carried on for the next 40 minutes without you being able to see everything. So what we've got here is the critical thinking series. So these are dials. So depending on the client that we're working with, depending on the needs of the organisation, we would either turn up our efforts in a particular area or turn down if everything was in good shape. But for the purposes of today, what I want to try and achieve is to stimulate your thinking and really share with you and give you some of the solutions and the concepts and the models that we've created, as I say, particularly in the area of judgment and decision making. Andy referred to the fact that we conducted our research over the past 3 years and continue to do so with a number of different industries, primarily financial services. The Abstract team have a strong affiliated background with financial services, but we also spoke to, with Andy's connections, a lot of people in sport and in the media. We even spoke with people in the military, biochemical industry, the pharma industry. But what I wanted to share with you today was particularly the findings with the financial services industry. And so what we have here is just some headline levels that hopefully, through your membership of the Chartered Banker and your careers to date in financial services, you can relate to some of these findings. So there was definitely a positive vibe from people post-2008 about the desired culture within the organisations they were working in. And there was acknowledgement that improvements have been made and some pretty tough lessons have been learned. And there was definitely a sense of it feeling like a much better place to work than at previous times. And those of us who worked during the financial crisis, it was kind of an obvious sentiment. And there was this kind of overwhelming vibe of a unilateral sense of empowerment coming through. But when we probed deeper and got into it further, we recognized that actually people were being told they were empowered, but there was limited evidence of this so-called empowerment. And not surprisingly, because of the recent history of the banking crisis, when most institutions pulled the shutters down and they left a little chink of light to say, yeah, we are still open, but we need to mitigate risk. It was creating a group characterization. And there was an understandable and natural desire just to follow process or instructions. And what happened was this was avoiding the independent judgment. And so we recognized that decision making was therefore often filtered into a safe, the computer says yes, or the computer says no. So, you know, I'm simplifying, I'm generalizing. So when we researched further and we looked at the evidence and the studies out there, one of the things that we came across was the Hogan Principle. And we really like this. So credit to Hogan. They said that character drives judgment, judgment drives decisions, and decisions drive business. We like this because it makes the complex really simple. So hopefully technology will work for us. I'd like to just do a poll, if I may, here. So Margot, is there a chance that we can launch our first poll? I know we've had a few technical issues prior to the webinar, so let's just see if we can get the first poll out there. And the question is which of those three elements, be it character, judgment, or decision making, in the Hogan maxim is most significant? So Margot, could we launch the poll there?
Thanks. So I've launched that, and that's in the vote tab for the audience to select.
Okay. Margot, I'm flying blind here, obviously only able to see my slides, so do tell me when you get some results in, just to see what our audience thinks in terms of those three elements.
So far, most of the votes are coming in for character.
Ah, wonderful. Brilliant. That was our view and opinion as well. Actually, character is the most tricky, the most complex, the most significant element of those three stages. And let's just self-reflect for a moment. Where does character come from? Well, it comes from our family. It comes from our upbringing. It comes from our friends. It comes from the communities that we grow up in. It comes from our education, and so on and so forth. Research tells us that by the age of 7, our foundation of values are pretty much done. We're cooked, we're baked at the age of 7. And from then on, we have references and experiences that build and strengthen our belief, which forms our character. Now, the average age of the people that we researched was in the region of 35 to 40 years of age. And what we recognized was that, again, research tells us that as individuals, we have 80,000 thoughts a day. So by the time we reach age 35, we've got over 1 billion references and experiences, many of which are different to the other person. So it's no wonder we find judgment and decision making quite tricky, quite difficult, and especially when we're working with others as part of teams and as part of large organizations. So when we developed this further, we thought, well, surely to provide the solutions, it's a third solution in character, a third in judgment, a third in decision making. We were wrong. We realized very quickly that actually it was more like Paretos Law, where actually 80% of the solution lies in understanding our character, understanding the character of those around us that were working as part of teams, and then as part of much bigger organizations. And some of the organizations that you work in today will compose of tens of thousands of people. So is it any wonder that this is a difficult area and a difficult one to get right most of the time? So we found that organizational character was 80% responsible for driving our individual reasoning and actions within the workplace. Therefore, the problems to solve were much bigger and far more complicated than we originally thought. So importantly, it's absolutely vital that we join up the company's vision and the company's purpose with the character and culture that's being created. Now, before we can move on from this point, with small teams, that's a lot easier to establish. Smaller companies, it's easier to establish. But if we're talking tens of thousands of people in the organization, then we have to move to a set of solutions and research that Abstract have created, which really get into the different layers of the organization and right down to the front line. And of course, today, there's not enough time to go into that in a great deal of detail. But the sort of things that we explore, and it's not rocket science, but those of us who are dealing with the clients and the customers, we actually research and ask questions such as, how passionate do I feel about the purpose of the organization I work for? How feasible or possible is it for me each day to achieve that purpose? Do I feel perhaps frustrated regularly by policy and guidelines preventing me from achieving the organizational purpose? Now, if the responses are negative at this point, we have a problem and we can't move on to provide solutions in judgment and decision making. We either have to change the vision, purpose and values, which is never a popular choice by senior members of an organization, or we actually have to introduce solutions that actually change the organizational character to make it more in tune with the vision and the purpose of the company. Now, if the responses from our solutions are positive, great, we can move on. So let's just develop character a little bit further. Let's have a look at a little bit more into character, because it's a real fascinating topic. It's one of my favorite slides, pictures here. You just know what the little girl is about to do and smash the piggy bank to smithereens, perhaps when your head is turned. Now, Maslow said, give a child a hammer and they'll treat everything like a nail. And actually, after 2008, understandably, there was a sentiment in the financial services industry because of the crisis where there was this sentiment. So let's remove the hammer. Let's try and reduce risk to an absolute minimum. But what we've seen in the last decade or so, and this has been really encouraging for us, is there definitely is this sentiment of actually, let's accept risk. Risk is part of business. It's part of what we do. And we must teach the child best use of the hammer. And we're trying to support organization and the industry with this best use of the hammer. So where do we start? And where do we look at character first of all? Well, one of our favorites was actually created back in the 80s by two human behavioral psychologists named Bolton and Bolton. And this is the original, this is the pure form. Many companies have taken this and they've given it colors and they've applied characters and animals to these categories. And I'm sure you'll probably either come across this or seen a similar version. But we love this. So at an individual level, it's about understanding the type of character we are. Now, the beautiful thing with Bolton and Bolton, it's a bit like the Ron Seal adverts in the past where the catchphrase was, they do pretty much what it says on the tin. And so Bolton created 4 boxes, not to put anybody in a box, but they recognized that we would identify with one primary characteristic attribute, be that a driver, an expressive, an amiable, or an analytical. And you can see the axes there. The horizontal axis moves from left to right, from an asking type of character disposition to a more telling character disposition. And then we have the vertical axis to a more controlled at the top there, emotional response. You can't always read analytical and driver people. You don't know what they're quite thinking. You don't know whether they're having a great day or a bad day. And then we have the amiables and the expressives where they're a bit more emotional. You can read them a bit more in terms of their emotional state, whether they're having good days or bad days. So at an individual level, we create this. Now, not wishing to overcomplicate it, we took our research further and we recognized that actually each of these characters, you could further dissect them by introducing concepts as tactical at the north end of the matrix to more strategic being visionary picture of where we're heading in the future, tactical being next step, navigating the next hurdle to overcome. But then what was really powerful, we recognized that expressives and drivers tend to be more reward-seeking in their characteristic style, and amiables and analytical are more threat avoidance. And so we overlaid some diagonal axes here to bisect the character styles and break it down further, so that as we work with clients, we can understand what is the propensity of character style in teams, and then build those teams up into divisions and take it up to an organizational level where we can actually understand the organizational character. And then we can compare that with the vision and the purpose. What you tend to find, by way of an example, is that sales and customer service facing teams are predominantly made up of expressive and amiable type characters, as you would expect, because that characteristic style lends itself typically to that sort of relationship management interaction. So character is an important step in this process. It's really important to understand the individual, the team, the division, and then the organization. So a flavor there, and you can actually get these Bolton and Bolton persona questionnaires. They're very effective tools, and a lot of our friends in HR use them for recruitment purposes in terms of building teams and for recruiting new staff. So when we've got that picture, we're then able to look at it and almost at an individual and organizational character, we can say, so what is the reality versus the perception? What is your personal view after understanding your character versus that of the organization? Are you the pussycat and the organization is the lion? Or are you the lion and the organization is the pussycat? Of course, if you've got a mirror image, then you've got synchronicity there, and you've got unity between the organizational character and the characters in the organization. So character, really, really important area of understanding and research. So let's take it a little bit further now. Let's move on to judgment. So our character's in good shape as an organization. There's alignment there between the teams and the individuals. So let's look at judgment. So the Oxford English Dictionary tells us the ability to make decisions or come to sensible conclusions. We recognize that actually this empowerment that I referred to at the beginning to be transferred into activity, people must first choose to engage. But they'll only choose to engage if there is psychological safety around making mistakes. Now, I think the industry, the financial services industry, is getting much better at this, but perhaps it wasn't quite as good at the psychological safety in the past. So this is an important component part. And what I'd like to now share with you is something that we created named the Spectrum of Consequence. And this provides a guideline safety net for you as an individual and for colleagues as part of teams who understand the spectrum of consequence to know when to engage and by how much. So let me just introduce the concept before I share with you the model. So we recognized that there was two spectrums. There was low consequence, where perhaps there was choice around elements such as access, service and assistance to our customers and clients. And then there was high consequence, which applies to regulation around advice, trading and investments. And across that spectrum from low to high, this is where the critical thinking concept came in. Now, importantly at this point, I must highlight that abstracts are not for one moment suggesting that rules and regulations are not a good thing. They are a great thing. We need stabilizers, we need handrails, we need guidelines, and particularly in areas such as advice, trading and investment. We've learned a lot of lessons from the past in financial services, and therefore those guidelines are absolutely critical. But perhaps where there can be more creativity at the lower consequence end of the spectrum around access, service and assistance, we can create that real sense of empowerment. You'll know, being customers yourselves of various institutions, it can sometimes be the little things that can be quite frustrating. So let's build this model up further still, and let me share with you the spectrum of consequence model. So there's quite a bit to take in, so let me try and simplify it for you. And again, we like 4-box matrices at Abstract. So you've got the 4 boxes here, but let's look at the axes first of all. So you've got the low control on the left-hand side moving through to high control. And you've got the vertical axis, which is low risk to high risk. What we worked out by looking at various case studies and various examples from our customers and from the people that we spoke with was that the combination of the risk and the control axes created clearly defined quadrants. So if I may start in the top left, where we have a situation that is high risk but that has a low level of control, a sense of danger, a feeling of uncertainty is created. And then if we move clockwise, where there's high risk, high control, there is regulation, and that gives us confidence. So as I said a moment ago, if we're investing or trading money on behalf of clients and customers, so that's regulation and gives us confidence. Where there is high control still being applied, but there is low risk, that leads to restriction, and it makes us feel really frustrated. And then finally, the second golden quadrant, if there's low risk and low control, that gives us choice. It gives us empowerment. Now, Abstract suggests that where we want to be operating is top right, regulation or confidence, or bottom left, choice and empowerment. If we find ourselves in any one of the other boxes, danger or restriction, we must look and see what we can influence, what we can control to move us into the golden quadrants. And this is a moving spectrum, so there is equilibrium needing to be created. And what we further deduced was that if we find ourselves on the left-hand side, there are certain selected actions that we can take because there is less control. But on the right-hand side, there are imposed actions. So it's typically either a yes, you can do that, or no, you can't do that. And obviously, where there's low risk, it gives us frustration, and where it's high risk, it gives us confidence. We actually worked with a client in London over the last 18 months, and they adopted this model throughout the organisation. It's used for project committee meetings. And last month, even during lockdown, they had a meeting where senior EXCO personnel were there, and members of the teams came, and they used the spectrum of consequence model, and with prior preparation they were able to achieve 27 decisions, some of them more important than others, but 27 decisions in a 1-hour meeting, which was absolutely fantastic to hear. And based on my personal experience of corporate life, I was lucky to achieve one decision in a meeting, and that often was, shall we end the meeting there? But let's bring this to life today in terms of what we're all facing. Let's look at COVID-19. And let's have a look at how COVID-19 has moved through this spectrum of consequence. Let me take you back to January, February time. Can't pinpoint exactly. We all learned differently about what was happening in the Far East and moving across through into Europe. But there was a perceived low level of risk, and there was little control being implied. So we were still operating in that choice empowerment, but we were beginning to hear more and more about COVID-19 and the potential implications. So COVID-19 was moving up from low risk to high risk, and it was getting close to the crosshairs. And there was a particular moment in time that caught my attention. There was a week of mass gatherings around a couple of sporting events, and it was Cheltenham Festival, and there was the Liverpool versus Atletico Madrid game in Liverpool. And I personally felt, and I know a few others did, that it was really above the crosshairs now. We were in a high risk area, and I wasn't quite sure if I had the opportunity to attend those events, whether I would have done or not. But of course, many people did, and did so in good faith because there was low control. But when we look back, there was a level of danger and uncertainty. And then, of course, Boris made his announcements, lockdown, full lockdown across the UK, and we immediately found ourselves in regulation. And it gave us a level of confidence. We may not have liked it, but actually it gave us a level of confidence that if we stick to the lockdown guidelines, then hopefully we should be okay. And then what we've seen is as the curve has decreased in recent days and weeks, is that the risk of COVID-19 is reducing, and it's probably moved round about back to the crosshairs. And now we've got a lessening of control by the government and the various devolved governments around the UK, which actually means that there's a degree of personal choice entering back into the equation. And it depends, of course, which group you're in. If you're young, single, and perhaps live in a more rural environment than in a city centre, then I would suggest that you're feeling pretty restricted and frustrated by even the current lockdown rules. Why can't things just go back to normality? So hopefully you can see as we've tracked COVID-19 that actually a situation can move, in this example, through all 4 quadrants. And as I suggest to you, the reason there's probably a bit of disagreement amongst friends and family and communities is because we're back at this crosshairs where the government is giving back a level of choice and lowering its control slowly but surely. But some of us may feel as though we're residing in different quadrants. So time for a second poll, Margot, if the technology works for us again, if you would. I'd like you to launch the second poll. And this is really just a bit of research, folks, for Abstract. We'd like to understand, based on the spectrum of consequence, as a personal individual or as a family unit, where do you currently feel, which quadrant do you feel you're in terms of today as part of the COVID-19 situation? So Margot, if you could let me know if we've launched that second poll, and let me know when you're getting any results coming through.
Yes, that's launched. I'll just give the viewers a little bit of time to submit their votes, but so far it is 50-50 between danger and restriction. Wow,
that's really interesting, isn't it? So we've got more or less a clear division between those 2 quadrants. It's no wonder. I'm not going to make comments as to whether people are right or wrong. They're obviously right because it's a personal choice how they are feeling, but it's probably no wonder that this week compared to, say, 5 weeks ago when we're in complete lockdown, that we've got this diversification in terms of sentiment. So thank you very much for participating. Let's move on and further develop this concept around judgment. Now I'm going to test our technology because BrightTalk was having a few issues with showing videos earlier this morning, but we'll see whether it's been rectified. When I was doing the research with the rest of the Abstract team, one of the questions that we asked everybody that we spoke to, we asked a set template of questions to everybody. One key question was, how do you form judgment? And we got the response back, which was majority of people would answer with things like gut feel, intuition, experience. And when we came back to base camp, we kind of sat down and with Andy and the rest of the Abstract team, there was a number of us, we all recognized gut feel, intuition, experience, but then we started to say, what is that? What does that actually mean? And so we had to set off and do some further research, and there's a lot of great stuff out there. There's a lot of stuff out there, but none of it was really making any sense until, that is, we stumbled across Professor Daniel Kahneman's work, and beautifully encapsulated in his book titled Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a terrific read. I recommend it to you. It's wonderful content, but it's a tough gig. It's a bit of a, you've got to do it in bite-sized chunks. So a number of us plowed our way through it, and it made a great deal of sense. Now, I'm going to see if my video works here. So I'm going to rely on Andy or Margot to say, Mark, it's not working, move on, and I'll bring Daniel Kahneman's concept to life in the next slide. But if it works, then happy days. And I think it's a 90-minute video that just sums up beautifully the concept of Daniel Kahneman's work. So let's give this a go.
Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. There is a compelling drama going on in our minds, a film-like plot between two main characters with twists, dramas, and tensions. These two characters are the impulsive, automatic, intuitive System 1 and the thoughtful, deliberate, calculating System 2. As they play off against each other, their interactions determine how we think, make judgments and decisions, and act. System 1 is the part of our brain that operates intuitively and suddenly, often without our conscious control. You can experience this system at work when you hear a very loud and unexpected sound. What do? You probably immediately and automatically shift your attention toward the sound. That's System 1. This system is a legacy of our evolutionary past. There are inherent survival advantages in being able to make such rapid actions and judgments. System 2 is responsible for our individual decision-making, reasoning, and beliefs. For instance, imagine you're looking for a woman in a crowd. Your mind deliberately focuses on the task. It recalls characteristics of the person and anything that would help locate her. This focus helps eliminate potential distractions, and you barely notice other people in the crowd. If you maintain this focused attention, you might spot her within a matter of minutes. Whereas, if you're distracted and lose focus, you'll have trouble finding her. The relationship between these two systems determines how we behave.
I'm assuming that worked. Margot, did that come through?
It all worked fine, thank you.
Ah, brilliant. Okay, wonderful. There's a bonus. So, okay, off we go again. So, Daniel Kahneman said, taking the complex and making it simple. We've got two parts of the brain, System 1 and System 2. Now, separate to Kahneman's work, we discovered that typically, as humans, use about 14% of our brain's capacity and power. So there's still some way to go in terms of the power of the brain. But we felt it kind of answered our question about gut sense, intuition, experience. Because what Kahneman says is that System 1 is a massive filing cabinet where stuff is stored that is called recognition. So all that, those 80,000 thoughts a day over our formative years and through adolescence and adulthood, it's all filed away in System 1. That's recognition. And that's the part of the brain we naturally and easily go to when we come across a topic and we think, oh, I recognize that. I know how to deal with this. And you make form a judgment, make a decision. And then sometimes it actually turns out differently to how you're expecting. And that's because Kahneman would suggest that we need to mobilize System 2. This is an underutilized muscle in the brain. It's slower. It takes a lot of effort. It really is the part of the brain we use when we're focusing on something or we're concentrating on something. So you'll know from personal experience if you've got a report to read or a document to read or a document to write or something to create, the likelihood is you're using your System 2. And that's why that typically you'll find that after about half an hour to an hour, you'll feel pretty worn out and exhausted. So System 1 and System 2, we felt answered our question in terms of gut feel and intuition. There's nothing wrong with System 1, but it needs to be handled with care. And actually for more complex or important situations, we encourage you to start thinking about that concentration, that focus attention that comes with System 2. And like any new behavior, any new habit, it will get easier over time. And therefore, the less cognitive energy required to apply the new behavior, the more likely it is to be repeated and therefore embedded. So it's a new habit that we need to form. You'll probably find that today, listening to me and looking at the complexity of critical thinking and judgment and decision making, you'll come off at 1 o'clock and you think, I could do with a break. It's probably because you've been using a bit of the System 2 as we've been going through some of our concepts today. So Thinking Fast and Slow, great book, great read. You will find you'll be using your System 2 when you sit down to read it. So do it in bite-sized chunks. So let's move into the sort of final segment of the presentation. Let's look at decision making. One of the friends of Abstract is Albert Einstein, and he was once asked if he had only 1 hour to solve a problem, what would we do? And we loved his response. And this actually is very effective in terms of decision making. He said, if I had an hour, I'd spend 55 minutes trying to understand the question, then I wouldn't need any more than 5 minutes to find the solution. The solution lies in forming and developing the precise understanding of the question to create sound judgment. We love that. So it's really important. So let me translate it a different way. Spend 55 minutes saying, what's our problem to solve? What is our desired outcome? Think of corporate life that I enjoyed many years in. The meetings, the committee meetings that you went to, and you would pass hours of time and people would come up with perhaps more interesting questions or more thoughtful topics rather than the focus on the problem to solve and the desired outcomes. So we developed this, and this is quite painful. We practice what we preach, and it is hard because you often think you've come up with the right question, but you need to go back to the drawing board. But it's well worth the investment, as Albert said, of the 55 minutes before moving too quickly to find the solution. So this is a further model we developed. So it's called the Trilogy of Answers. So to make a decision, we must first understand the question. So around the problem to solve and your desired outcome, the question should be formed beginning with a do and be self-enclosed, complete with where and when scenarios. And then what you'll often find is you'll have the trilogy of answers, which is yes, no, or best alternative. So let me bring this to life by way of a simple example that I'm sure many of us will have experienced in the years in recent times in corporate life. So let's look at this example. So the question is, you've been invited to a prestigious event by an external provider. You'd love to go, and it would be a great ambassadorial opportunity for you, the company, and the relationship that you're building with the external provider. However, since the introduction of the Bribery Act, which was in 2010, almost anything of this nature is not accepted. So what is the question? What is the answer? Now, the first thing to understand is the Bribery and Corruption Act was introduced to stop, in the main, groups of people, large organisations, succumbing to bribery and corruption. It was not designed to prevent relationship building and the engendering of good relations between providers and organisations. But I've been part of corporate life where all of a sudden this type of thing was not accepted. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we simply get rid of the rules and regulations and internal processes, but there's an opportunity here to build a good relationship. So actually, if we think of it in the context of the Bribery and Corruption Act, System 1 takes care of, can I go or can I not go? So the answer is yes or no. However, what we're encouraging to think about is use System 2. There's an honourable, genuine opportunity to build a relationship with an external provider. They've invited you to an ambassadorial opportunity. So the question is, do I decline the invitation gracefully? Yes, in which case you miss out on the opportunity to attend and build a relationship. No, you go along and attend, and we're not condoning that because you put your potential employment at risk of getting into bother with senior management. But is there a best alternative? This is a genuine opportunity. So the best alternative using System 2 would be, actually, there's good relationships to be developed here. So actually, maybe I should create a small business case, put it up to senior management to sign off and actually approve my attendance at the ambassadorial opportunity. Of course, the answer may come back from senior management, no, you can't attend. What we're encouraging here is deployment of that system too, and not to simply default to the yes or no alternatives. Finally, in decision making, we don't often work as individuals. We often operate collectively as small teams, as large committees, as project steering groups. And so we know all too well that there is an overwhelming deluge of information these days on platforms, internally, through emails, copied into emails, etc. And so the internet access, business communications, social media groups gives us an overwhelming abundance of information. And we have FOMO, fear of missing out. We have Wi-Fi, want for inclusion, and we've got a new one under COVID-19, which is FOGO, fear of going out. So we have these phenomena that influence our ability to operate collectively. I just want to share briefly with you an example that we came across when Andy was out in India working with a client. The bank in India, there was a newly appointed head of IT, and in the early days and weeks, he was asked to form part of a group that was looking at which business schools internationally the bank of India, the bank in India was looking to work with. And he was asked for his opinion. He was an educated individual and he studied at business schools. And so he responded with Harvard, MIT, INSEAD, Oxford, Cambridge, and Stanford. Business schools would all recognize. What he shared with Andy and ourselves was that 5 months later, a lengthy series of email traffic, copied into many a personnel, face-to-face meetings, papers, studies, discussion groups, they eventually agreed on a short list, which happened to be the top 5, as he had commented at the outset, to work with as their preferred education suppliers, although not exclusively. There's a certain irony there, that after all the effort and work, they decided to work with those 5, but not exclusively. And of course, they were working with Abstract out there as well. So we need to wean ourselves of this want for inclusion addiction for the good of everyone. And then we have a number of solutions in the area of groupthink, and unfortunately not enough time to go into huge amounts of detail, but I wanted to give you something. So I wanted to give you this kind of concept that groupthink, when you think about those forums that we're members of, that we attend periodically, groupthink happens when there is a strong, persuasive group leader. Now, thankfully, today we're seeing the characteristics of leadership need to be more strong and considerate rather than days of the past where it was strong and ruthless. We also see groupthink happen where there's a high level of group cohesion. There perhaps is an inner circle in amongst the circle that is quite influential. And we often see groupthink where there's intense pressure from the outside to make a good decision, perhaps from senior management or key stakeholders. So groupthink-like behavior is found in many situations across many types of groups and team settings. So it's really important to look out and address the key symptoms. Now, we have at Abstract a 9-step solution. I'd be delighted to continue conversations outside of this webinar and share with you. But I wanted to give you one key takeaway today if you don't follow up with the chartered bankers or ourselves. And that is actually the key to avoiding groupthink is actually provide the problem to solve or the question to answer, as Einstein was talking about earlier, in advance for anonymous input to the chairperson. And that's, quite a discipline and really effective in avoiding groupthink. And of course, it should be reserved for the most significant of problems to solve or questions to answer rather than the mundane. So there we have it. We're at the end. And so if I just sort of summarize, I've shared with you character drives judgment, judgment drives decisions, and your decisions drive your business. I've introduced to you and looked at System 1 and System 2 thinking. We've also delved into character style and organizational character. But the System 2 thinking is the effort it takes. We've looked at the spectrum of consequence. I've shared the COVID example and taken us through that to establish risk and evoke our critical thinking. And then we just touched on some groupthink dynamics and avoiding groupthink in terms of sharing the problem to solve or the question to answer in advance. So that concludes the webinar today. I'll hand back to Andy and Margot to take any questions there may be.
Great, thanks, Mark. Well done, and I hope you all enjoyed that. There's a lot of information there, and it's probably quite difficult to process it all, and hopefully you've been taking lots of notes. We've got 4 questions, so thank you for that. We've not got the person that's asked the question, so I can't give you a name check, but let's go to the first question that came in, and it was, given the current climate, what tools can we use to move from uncertainty? So this is with a spectrum of consequence. The question actually came in just before Mark then related it to COVID-19. So maybe the question was answered by Mark, but just to put a bit more into that, communication is absolutely key, and clarity of communication is really important when you consider where you can move from that uncertainty into regulation. And I think there's been a good case study, hasn't there, recently, with how there was a change in message from government about COVID, about, it was stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, and then it was stay alert. And that caused lots of ambiguity. And then you had the whole Dominic Cummings affair recently about how he interpreted the very clear stay-at-home message that was there. And so I think what we're faced with now, there's a bit more choice that people are having to bring in, or judgment that they're bringing to what's been given from the government, because for a while it was very much regulation, and there was the confidence there, wasn't it, that you weren't going to be transmitting the virus if you're not going out staying at home, and that was all the measures that were guided for. So there's no doubt that communicating with clarity can really help people move from one segment to the other.
Thanks, Andy. I would agree with that, and that's a good example of where a lot of uncertainty has come about. I think when Boris made that announcement about the stay alert and the first release from lockdown, it went from regulation and control into, for many people, danger and uncertainty. And I think clarity is absolutely paramount. It's lack of clarity that causes stress. And I had a lot of empathy for a lot of people that Sunday night who had the prospect of being asked to return to work. Could they return to work with childcare? Was their employer still in lockdown, or were they opening up? And so I think it suddenly went from a national situation to a more community and family and employer situation. So it's membership of those respective groups that you need to seek clarity. So is my employer asking me to return to work, or can I still work from home? If they are asking me to return to work, are they empathetic to the fact that I've got childcare issues? So it's the pursuit of that clarity, Andy, that I think you're absolutely right, could move a situation back into regulation and control. Of course, there's no guarantee, but there's a greater likelihood of regulation and control, or choice and empowerment, if you pursue the clarity required with those member groups that you're part of, employer, family, community, etc.
Indeed. So great. So thanks for that first question. I hope that's answered a bit more. The second question we got was, can you thrive in an organisation when your personal character is different to the organisational character? And I think it's a great question, because there's no doubt the size of the organisation will determine a large part of the answer to this question, because if you're in a large organisation, your personal character is not going to be as noticeable as it is in a much smaller organisation. And actually, Mark and I are two very good examples of that. Both of us worked for the Royal Bank of Scotland back in the day, when there was, 60,000, 70,000 probably employees. We're now at Abstract, where there's 5 directors. So our personal character really does impact on how we operate together. So you can thrive in an organisation when your personal character is different from the organisational character. And when you get the alignment, you might have a much more productive environment, and you might your personal character then will be aligned to lots of things, so it might be easier to thrive. But if there's a bit of a disconnect, you can still thrive in the bigger organisations, certainly. but it's striving to find the areas that you think that you can really start to get that alignment and just adjust. Obviously, it's much easier for you to change your personal character than it is the organizational character. But what you'll find when you get that alignment between the two, then that's when things really start to happen.
Yeah, just to add to that, Andy, I think it's a great question actually, because it really presents a bit of a conundrum, and it depends where you're being asked to work as well, because large organisations have so many different divisions and departments. And take banks per se, I think they've been brilliant in terms of the last decade of creativity and an entrepreneurial sort of spirit in certain areas, and they've needed to do that, had to do that to survive with the other versus the other fintech. So clearly, if you're of that character disposition, being asked to work in that area, that's a marriage made in heaven. However, and I'm sorry I can't pull up the slide, but if you are a threat avoidance type character being invited or asked to work in a reward seeking area, that could be a difficult scenario, and we would never support anybody transgressing their own personal values and their character and being asked to do something that they don't feel comfortable in doing. So sometimes, just sometimes, you have to sort of face up to the fact that I'm not actually best suited to this area, but there will be an area in an organization or in the organization that suits my character. So it's a real good question, that.
Good. Okay, moving on to the third question that we received. So the question is, if you make your decision and then it doesn't get the right outcome, would you work through the same exercises to come to a new decision? And what's interesting in this is that it's the classic definition of insanity. If you keep doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. So if you ask that first question and whatever that drives you to the outcome, if you ask the same question, then it's going to take you to the same outcome. So it's all about asking a different question from the knowledge of why the outcome came about. So it's about redefining, reframing the question every time, and you will get a different outcome. Now, we're not saying that you manipulate the situation constantly, so until you get the right outcome, but just ask the different question. And it could be a similar question, ask in a slightly different way, then you might get a different outcome.
We've found that to our expense, haven't we, Andy? We practice what we preach, and there's been many an incident in the last year when we thought we've got the right problem to solve, the right question to ask, and we've moved forward, and we learn very quickly, blimey, we got it wrong. So you have to go back to the drawing board, and that's why that 55-minute of Einstein, it's conceptual 55 minutes. Of course, you might find you go on for hours and days and then discover and learn that actually you didn't ask the right question. You have to go back to the drawing board. But if you've got the ability and clearly the sense to recognize we got this wrong, we've made a mistake, let's go back and revisit it, then you learn very, very quickly, although it does, I have to say from personal experience, at times feel pretty painful.
Indeed. And then the final question we've received was, would you say there's a best combination of character types when forming teams? Again, that's a great question, and I think I love being part of a team, and both in a sporting context, but also in a business context. And there's no doubt having a balance of characters of character types in a team is very effective. If you look at the Bolton character types being expressive, driver, analytical, amiable, there's no doubt having a balance between all four would make that team more effective. And it's what's interesting. One personal experience I had a business development team when I was working in financial services. And before we'd done this exercise, we did the Bolton exercise. Before that, I was seeing how the behaviours were intra-team, within the team. And then I could see there was a few issues. And then we did the exercise, realised that we had 3 drivers and an amiable. And so what's key when you understand the characteristics that go with these personality types, is how you can communicate with them, how you influence them, how you can talk to each other. If drivers talk to drivers, they can just bounce heads and smash heads together and then dust themselves down and move on. But when a driver was speaking to an amiable, they had to tailor their approach accordingly. And so it's a fantastic way of understanding how teams operate more effectively together when you understand the personality types that are involved. But what the research has also shown that if you're starting a team from scratch, then an amiable is the first position that should be filled. They are the most important. They're the glue that almost hold things together. So undoubtedly, there's not one best combination of character types. Each team is different to whatever that team is trying to achieve. But it's certainly good to have a balance throughout. Okay, I think there's Margot, I'm going to pass back to you. We've got no more questions waiting to be answered. So just on behalf of Mark, myself, and the Abstract team, thank you for joining today's webinar. I hope you found it worthwhile. And I'll now pass you back to Margot to close things off.
Thanks so much. That was a great presentation, Mark and Andy, and thank you to the viewers for their questions. I hope that everyone found that enjoyable and insightful. Just to ask one final favour of our audience, please rate today's webcast. The feedback is greatly appreciated and it helps us shape any future webcasts that the Institute can provide. So thank you again to Mark and Andy, and thank you all today for your participation, and have a great afternoon.